So I'm here with Anthony Bartlett, who's he earned his PhD at Syracuse University in 1999, and he previously ran a center for homeless in London, England. Before that, served as a Roman Catholic priest. And so he is someone who has been working and writing on nonviolence and Girardian anthropology for some time, and it's a great pleasure and honor to have him on the show. Thank you for coming.
It's a thrill to be here, David. I'm so pleased to be here with you and your listeners.
And I'm going to hold up your book here for the video watchers, Theology Beyond Metaphysics, which just came out recently. And it's transformative semiotics of René Girard. This is a very interesting topic. And I'm just going to try to do a basic introduction of these ideas with you today. If we can achieve that, it'd be great.
Sure.
So, let's start with the first, just right off the bat, Theology Beyond Metaphysics. So my show, Things Hidden, is mostly for fans of René Girard. So people who have a basic introduction to these ideas and they're interested. So having that as the background for our audience, why do we need a theology beyond metaphysics? Maybe we should define metaphysics first and why we need to go beyond it.
Well, to answer the question, David, I think the best way is to give a little bit of personal history. In terms of my own academic formation, I came to Syracuse University in 1993, and really it was actually René Girard who directed me here. I became really interested and fascinated with his work around about 1990. I started reading his stuff more carefully. I'd heard of him briefly before, but I started reading his stuff carefully, and I asked where I could study his material in more detail and from a theological perspective. That's what I was interested in, biblical theological perspective. And he said I could go to either Innsbruck in Austria or go to be with Jim Williams, who wrote Bible, Violence, and Sacred in Syracuse, New York. I thought, well, they speak English in America and in North America, and also there's a lot of snow in Austria. I wasn't prepared for the amount of snow here in Syracuse. But anyhow, I arrived here and I started studying in a department of religion, a self-proclaimed postmodern and kind of /theistic, that's the way they describe themselves, department of religion. And I obviously trained as a priest in Roman Catholic priest in seminary in terms of traditional philosophy and theology, but this is the first time I really, after various detours in my life, that I actually seriously encountered contemporary thinking and contemporary post-structuralist thinking, and so I was very much trained in that, and I at the same time I was thinking about Girard, and I came to understand that, and I will explain this further as we go along, but I came to understand Girard actually belonged very thoroughly within the postmodern context, and the suspicion of metaphysics derives really, I would say, to give a very short answer to that, derives beginning with Kant, Immanuel Kant, at the end of the 18th century, and his idea that, well, if you think metaphysically, there are all these what he calls the contradictions of metaphysics. They all, one thinker contradicts another, so you can never really be sure what is true or not true metaphysically. So he arrived at his theory of transcendental knowledge and reason, and which has had a huge impact, and it tended to shift the emphasis. He called it himself a metaphysics of the mind. But it shifted the emphasis away from metaphysics, and then in more recent terms, in terms of structuralism and post-structuralism, there was a kind of collapse of confidence in the possibility of knowing abstract absolute truth, and that really we were left with the just our general malaise as human beings, as thinking creatures, that all we can do is think, but there's no end to it, and there's no result to it. There's nothing we can truly find out, except the fact that we're on this kind of amazing journey of thought. And so that's very much the contemporary scene. But in terms of what this might mean as a Christian thinker, as a theologian, of course, Christianity doesn't begin with philosophy. It begins with a written and oral message, a tradition of story and events contained in story that we get in what we call the Bible and the Christian New Testament. And so it's very much a matter of words communicated, but in the heart of that, there's a claim that there is this God of revelation who wants to be known and wants to get involved in our lives, that kind of thing. So Christianity does not begin with metaphysics; it begins with the message, with the gospel, and it's only really as Christianity reached out into the culture of its time in the late first century, the beginning, and then later on in the second century, third century, that it began to assimilate the thought, the thinking, basically, of the Greeks, the Greek thinkers who invented philosophy and certainly invented metaphysics. But then, to then arrive at the final point, I was convinced by my own experience at the Department of Religion and working with a postmodern environment, that just to see Christian truth in terms of ideas and kind of even doctrine that is expressed in ideas that apparently have some kind of eternal abstract validity, actually does a disservice to the basic engine of Christian existence, the gospel, which is a message that is transforming the actual cultural conditions and human conditions in which we exist. And of course, then that brings you full circle to Girard, who said that things hidden from the foundation of the world have been revealed through the biblical tradition, and especially the gospel tradition. So I felt that ultimately there was a convergence, a strong convergence between the postmodern world in which I studied and the Girardian vision and really revelation that we get, especially in that book, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, and also his other work as well. So, it's the convergence of that progression of thought that ends in post-structuralism and deconstruction, and Girard himself, that brings me that brought me then to think in terms of semiotics, something that escapes, I believe, or largely escapes metaphysics and belongs more intimately to the character of Girard's thought.
Did Girard engage some of the semioticians that you were studying in this book?
No, very interesting. He didn't. He did, and he stayed away from that. And Girard generally stayed away from philosophy. He was a very great thinker and a smart, brilliant thinker, but he concentrated so much on the work that he had in hand and the disclosure of mimesis, violence, and the scapegoat, and using everything that was all the evidence that he could from human practice, from anthropology, ethnography, psychology, that kind of, but some philosophy as well. But the larger philosophical framework in which, what I was just talking about there, that was something he did not engage in, very deliberately didn't engage in it.
Yeah, he was very skeptical of philosophy in general and psychology, and he saw those as kind of continuations of mythic thinking, right?
Yes, I think so, and especially in that book, which we've referred to again and again, Things Hidden, he has a sense that philosophy and Western thought generally has never escaped its violent origins, and that the logos of Christianity, which is a theological word, coming from John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word. So in other words, God is communicated through the Word, the logos. He says that is a completely different principle for understanding and for being in the world. He delineates quite a sharp division between philosophy and revelation there, and in fact, actually, is fairly, as you say, fairly skeptical, if not contemptuous, towards the philosophical tradition. He backed away from that to some degree. I mean, didn't express himself with the same forcefulness afterwards. But yes, that, and I think that lies at the core of his thought.
And this is kind of a detour for a second, or off a tangent, but do you think that his approach to seeing the gospel logos as fundamentally incompatible, where with the the Heraclitean logos, do you see that as contradicting some of the attempts to show the integrated ideas? Like, for example, I'm thinking of the book out of the Orthodox faith about the idea of Christ, the eternal Tao, and this idea of the logos having some foreshadowing in Taoist writings and poetry. Do you see that as is that project kind of incompatible with the Girardian approach to seeing the Greek logos and the gospel logos as incompatible? Or,
well, David, I tend in that direction myself, but I having been trained in a postmodern department, I never want to come down too heavily on one side or the other, but I do tend in that direction. And
which direction? Just
the direction that says the Christian logos is the disclosure of something radically new, and that it's when we see it as foreshadowed in something like Taoism, or shall we say Greek thought itself, the logos of, because the early Christian fathers, as they're called, claimed people like Heraclitus and Plato as Christians before Christianity, because they talked in terms of the logos, and they didn't see any radical distinction. They saw an anticipation there. But I think the Girard's brilliance is to see that. And it's a demanding insight, is to see that there's something about human existence right from the very roots. It's not just that we've gone slightly astray. There's something in our roots, in our humanization, that got us off on the wrong track to begin with, and that Christianity and the Bible, not just Christianity, the whole Hebrew kind of Jesus tradition, shows us that. Otherwise, he wouldn't have ended up getting crucified. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, if this guy Jesus is the logos, well, why are we crucifying him? I mean, why are we killing him? There's got to be something incompatible there. And so, it's Augustine. Augustine, you can quote Augustine for bad things and for good things. He says a lot of good things, but he says that the pagans' greatest virtues are still vices. That when we build these castles in the air, and they are beautiful, and there's a lot to them. But there's something about the biblical tradition which is more radical than that, and calls us to something profoundly transformative. It's not just a convergence at the higher point, which is where, kind of, I would say, liberal religious thinking tends to use that image a lot. That we all roads meet to the same point at the top of the mountain. And there, there's value in that because it's a harmonious and then it's non-violent. It doesn't try to make the other bad. But the Christian revelation, I think, especially with Girard's thought, doesn't go to the top. It goes to the bottom. It goes to the roots of things, to the abyss, as I call it in my first book, Across Purposes, the abyssal truth of our lives, and it intervenes there in order to reveal love, not thought, not the purity of thought, but the possibility of love. And so there's something radically different. I tend in that direction to think that there's something radically different in the biblical and New Testament revelation.
So again, so it's, if we try to see things again, like I know it's kind of off topic, but it's just something I wanted to pick your mind about, which is if you try to see some of the foreshadowing in things like, again, Taoism or whatever, we're going to miss the real gravity of what's being revealed in the cross.
I think so. I mean, there is value. You see, that you don't want to be kind of fundamentalist about this, that it's only if you haven't read Things Hidden and embraced it fully, then you're not a Christian and you're not going to be saved, something like that, You don't want to say that. And in communicating with another tradition, like the Eastern traditions, like Taoism or Buddhism, there are all and all that kind of interfaith stuff. There's always something to be learned, and there's always a journey to be undertaken. It's an important journey, but at the same time, as saying that, I would say that to be faithful to if you're trying to be faithful to the other, and learn from him or her what they have to say, you also have to be faithful to your own tradition, and your own tradition, or my own tradition as a Christian, is that there's something very profound being unearthed here. But that what it is not this. It's not this horrible kind of therapy that tells you basically what a horrible person you are, and I don't know what the result would be. This is in order to reveal love. The point of the cross is simultaneously with revealing human violence, which it does. It reveals divine love. The two things happen simultaneously and together, and that is the great wonder of New Testament revelation, that in the very worst thing happening, the very best thing happens as well. So to hold on to that, and that's what I learned from Girard. Girard was a religious conservative, but actually a very, very progressive thinker. And that's the way I see him, and I tend to try to follow in that way.
It's kind of paradoxical, but it works that way, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yes,
I wanted to ask too about there's an evolutionary dynamic to Girard's theory that you have talked about, and there's a question that has been asked of Girard, and I want to ask you about it in the context of the book that we're discussing today, which is it something, and I think you've kind of answered it with this inbreaking, this revelation, but some have suggested, okay, you look at some of the things, again, some of the progress being made in things like Greek society, and some of the insights that the playwrights have in kind of undermining some of the sacred violence.
Yeah.
Obviously, it wasn't to the full level that we see in the Gospels. You look at traditions like the Jains, where they're critiquing sacrificial violence. You look at these different things. Was it something inevitable that humans would have evolved eventually and figured out culturally? If not, if the gospel didn't happen, if the Christ didn't arrive, would have maybe taken 1,000 or 2 more years to get to the point where, okay, we're starting to slowly wean ourselves off of these objects that we use, these sacrificial bludgeons that we use?
I I actually don't think so. I don't think that that evolutionary possibility was there before. That possibility is there now, I think, because of the Gospels. There's this kind of like infection in human culture where it has been changed. I mean, that's the Girardian argument, and that you can see that change happening on many fronts, not maybe least of all in the churches. You can see it on artistic and political fronts, that infection of the Christian gospel. But I think human beings have always had not just a suspicion, but a knowledge of what they're doing. For this to work, to turn the victim into a god, which is what Girard says happens. We have this collective orgy of violence, and we kill an individual, and then the peace that reigns afterwards transforms our actual consciousness, our actual being in the world, and as a result of that, we attribute that transformation to this killed creature, this murdered creature, and call that, and then misrecognize the violence, and then call the creature, the murder victim, a god. Unless we had some sense of the whole process that we were engaged in, that we did what we did, all those resulting emotions, the range of those emotions which creates the sacred and which creates culture would not be there. We have to have a sense of the violence that was generated by the god, by the one we blamed. We have to have a tremendous sense of that. And a playwright, like we're talking about the Greek playwrights and poets, being aware of the human processes, especially the religious sacrificial events, and Dionysian, especially Dionysian religion, they would have seen, it doesn't take much to begin to sense what's happening, and for that ancient knowledge to be raised, to break through the veils of misunderstanding, so that you could actually present it to some degree on the stage. But the key difference and the pivotal difference with the Gospels is that someone has to be prepared, I think, to go the whole way and suffer that process, and to forgive it, to not to retaliate. So we have the suffering servant, or the figure of someone like Joseph in Genesis. And then, of course, we have Jesus. You have to have that cultural process where you're not going to retaliate. You're not going to reflect back into the human system. And just a kind of neutrality, just shutting down, which is what most human beings would do in a circumstance. They, like that, they would shut off. It's the last thing you can do. You can't even do that. You have to be prepared to still relate to humanity, even as it does its worst, in order for there to be a point of reference to break you free. So in other words, I'm saying that the Greek dramatic tradition can remove the veils, but they can't set you free. At the end, the chorus is always going to say something like, "Holy crap, that was terrible, what happened there. And we better not do what the hero did." Whatever his name,
Oedipus.
Oedipus, there you are, thank you very much. We better not do what Oedipus did, otherwise the same thing's going to happen to us. So have you not been entertained, as it says in the movie Spartacus, Gladiator, have you not been entertained? I've entertained you by bringing you so far, so close, but we're not going to change anything. The change, the ability to create a new community around a new focus, only comes in the biblical tradition, I believe. And you've got that in the Judaic tradition, and then especially you've got it in the person of Jesus.
is the power of it the actual performance art that Jesus goes through in performing the role of the scapegoat in such explicit fashion, or is it the media depiction of the story that actually provides the nuclear power that sets it apart from these other partial revelations of the sacrifice? Does that make sense?
I think it's the performance art of Jesus, along with, as I said, the interior attitude, which is going to, impossibly stick with it to the end, and not retaliate. I mean, it's enormous performance. I mean, that's what it is. You couldn't have had the crucifixion unless you have the Dionysian rituals before it. And Tammuz, it talks about, is it in Ezekiel, that they had some, it seems like they were worshiping Tammuz, which is kind of some form of that. In kind of overt affliction of an individual and the emotions that are raised through that, that very deliberate seeing the suffering of the God in some of those traditions. Jesus replicates that, he really does, but he also replicates it he doesn't do it religiously, he does it within the political and social circumstances of his time. It's enormous. That's why I think the movies, like you say, the people who copy this performance art, especially movies, are so popular. How many movies have been made about this? It's because it's great film. It's great movie making. And
yeah, I mean, every movie in the top blockbusters are all dealing with questions of whether the hero should vanquish their opponent when they have the chance or self-sacrifice and show mercy. That's the question behind the top crowd pleasers. Everybody's bedazzled by that question.
That's exactly right, David. I mean, the hero has to go to that point because it's an essential human point now. I mean, I think it was always there, but as I said, no one had the courage to pursue it before the biblical tradition. And I mean, you've got a figure like Joseph who pursues it, and who knows how that story got written up in Genesis. But there has to be some kind of willingness to suffer at the hands of your brothers, as Joseph did, and then say, okay, well, God meant it for good, and I'm going to mean it for good. You have to go that whole way.
Some might wonder, how can such radical critiques of sacrificial myth be in the same text like Joseph, as then you find, more classical style presentations like King David slaying Goliath, or Achan being, punished for taking some loot or silver or something and lying about it. Why are those pieces? And just to comment on that, any thoughts on that? You've probably written about that already.
Because it's a human book. I mean, you've got to have all those elements in it. I mean, if you ever set out to write a novel, you've got to put crowd-pleasing things in it. And I don't say that's why, David slaying Goliath or wiping out the Philistines or whatever it is put in there to please the crowds. It's put there because it's part of a human storytelling. But within that storytelling tradition, something is always welling up. So you get this incredible thing like Job.
Do you believe in those? Because I've never read like Girardian analysis of some of those more classic battle stories and King David slaying the beast. It sounds like Beowulf versus Grendel and stuff.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Have you looked at those stories, and do you see some subversive Girardian scapegoating and deconstruction even in those stories, or sometimes it's not there in some certain episodes?
I mean, what you have really is you have this heroic figure of David in this instance. And apparently he wrote some great songs, So you have this literary tradition alongside this heroic tradition. And he says, Lord, have mercy on me, my God, a sinner. I have been a sinner from my youth, kind of thing. There's a sense that, the hero is flawed. And especially when, the tradition says that when he committed this great crime, having the husband of Bathsheba, Uriah, assassinated, then he repents, and he accepts his guilt. So the stories all belong together, kind of have one story with the other. There's a grand narrative. And so in the overall narrative, there's always that subversive element. And that's what makes it beautiful, you see, because
Right.
it's a court narrative, but it's not just him wiping out his enemies. It's him seriously messing up and being known to mess up, and so that's where it comes. And that's why it's semiotic, incidentally. It's because you need that range, you need that kind of universe of signs to bring you to the central point. And if you argued philosophically, you would never get there. I mean, you actually have to change the neural receptors, the way in which our stories are embedded in us and become part of us, in order for that pathway to. So semiotics is a very transformative way of looking at things, and I think Girard actually used that when he actually in Things Hidden, he goes through a whole number of texts from the Old Testament. He just doesn't state it analytically. He runs through the text to show you how this thing works, and that's how it works. It works through these stories, changing our mindset, and not just the mindset, just the actual constituents, the pathways by which we understand, and the way we run through ourselves, our own possibilities. I mean, where did we get that possibility of actually being loving to the other side, of self-sacrificing for the other, and not for the sake of heroism, but really for the sake of love, unless that story's been told to us in some ways and it's become embedded. So it's a deeply human thing, and it's a non-metaphysical thing. In other words, that you're looking at that question from underneath now, from how we work and progress as human beings, rather than the philosophical tradition and where the non-metaphysical viewpoint came from. Underneath, we follow these stories, and we do so with a brain capacity of something like 95 billion neurons or whatever it is. I mean, we have this huge number of neurons. What are they doing? They're processing all the time. They're processing our existence and who we are in relationship, and it's very slow, and it's painstaking, and it's negated more than the transformative thing is negated rather than affirmed. But it does show, I think, ultimately that transformation is what's at stake, because it actually works. You could see it working. You could see it working in individual minds. You could see it working in culture, which is a sharing of the minds, etc., etc. And incidentally, that is Charles Peirce's point of view. He's the thinker that I use in Theology Beyond Metaphysics. He's a great American thinker, and he says that both truth and change come collectively through the process of discernment. I mean, he doesn't actually use that word, but it's basically that of human history.
What gave I want to go to Charles Peirce and learn a little bit about him, but before, what gave those writers of the Genesis text such penetrating, brilliant, progressive insights so that we're still not catching up to thousands of years later? We could employ the theological approach. It was God inspired. That's fine. And I accept that. But is there any other explanations that might go along with that?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. It's a very good question, because if we're talking about a semiotic process, which is not a grand, I think it ends up being a cosmic process, but we don't look at it as a cosmic process. We look at it as a human process. It has to be traceable back in some fashion. And I think, in answer to your question, that the key moment was the Babylonian exile. So when the kind of educated classes, the priests and the aristocracy and the skilled people of Jerusalem were all hauled off into exile in Babylon, and many were killed, and it would not have been a pleasant journey for sure. Many would have died. They begin to reflect on what this relationship means, and with their God, with Yahweh. And normally, I would say that if your God has let you down really badly like that, so that your big city and your tradition by that point, something like 1,000 years, is crushed by this invading empire from 1,000 miles away, and they have nothing but supreme contempt for you, well, you'd give up on that God. That God is not worth it in terms of caring for you and assuring your victory. I mean, that's what use is the God if that God cannot do that, cannot secure. I mean, basically, gods are our employees. They work for us.
They're civil servants, government.
They really are. And if they mess up badly, they should be fired. And I think that's what human beings have done. But to stick with this God, like Jeremiah says, don't worry, you'll come back after 70 years or whatever it is. And so to maintain that relationship is itself a breakthrough, to maintain that relationship in the depths of kind of annihilation, of destruction of your apparent destruction of your culture and your power that goes along with it. To maintain that is something new. It's something dramatically new. I mean, of course, when the exiles return, they rebuild the city. So they go back to square one, which is what we would all do. I mean, it's not like they've reached perfection, because nobody has, like we always rebuild that old city, but still there's a breakthrough with that relationship. And second Isaiah, comfort ye, my people, your time of affliction is over. You've been afflicted too much. This sense of compassion and relationship in the depths, despite everything, is something dramatically new. So I think the writer of Genesis wrote around that time. He or she wrote within those circumstances, within that context. And the breakthrough of the end of Genesis, so Genesis begins with, as you know, with the Garden of Eden, and before that, the creation stories, and then with Cain and Abel, and then this whole bunch of stories of violence, of the annihilation of the Shechemites, and the attempt on Joseph's life, and the jealousy of various people, the kind of mayhem of normal human existence, to end up with the intentional forgiveness of his brothers by Joseph cannot be an accident. We as Christians kind of pass over it, or have passed over it, because we say, oh, that's just a foreshadowing of Jesus. Okay, done and dusted. That's all we needed to know. That he's a type of Jesus to come. No, it's a semiotic preparation, and that semiotic preparation would not have come without the relation. So that's the other part of a thought of semiotics, is that it's always to do with the construction of a relationship in some way or other. There's always going to be a relation within a sign, and a sign works because of relation, and that's laid out in the book. That within the loss of Jerusalem, within the loss of everything, their king, their army, their city, their temple, the relationship remains, and actually somehow or other becomes better, rather than just a threat of revenge or punishment. That experience then inspires a writer like whoever wrote Genesis to write what he or she did. And so it definitely doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a real formative experience that is then expressed basically in a novel form. They call it the Joseph novella. That the last kind of half of Genesis is third is really all about Joseph. So it's an extended story, and it's a good story. It's a great story. This guy loses everything, then he's smart, makes his way to the top, saves the whole country, and then he forgives his brother. Actually, that's just stuck on there at the end, but it's the most important bit. So it's a good question, and I think none of those transformative stories, the biblical stories, come out of nowhere by any means. They come out of real experience, and that's something that would be different from a Greek play, a Greek drama. You'd have the hero kind of misled by his or her own hubris, doing something terrible, and then becoming the victim. But you would not have any kind of conversion in terms of that person. I mean, Oedipus comes pretty close in the second and third place about Oedipus, but he's still he's blinded. He blinds himself, and he's stuck at that moment. He's stuck at that moment of his crimes, of his expulsion, and that's the tragedy of his story. So it is pushing towards. Oedipus does push towards the possibility or the hope of conversion, but it's the Judaic Babylonian tradition that really enters into that collectively as a community, enters into that place where this other possibility arises.
But at that time in history, they weren't the only people that have been, brought into exile, but were they the only people that we know of that kept their God in that country?
They're the only people who wrote the story.
Yeah.
In that way. There's no, I don't know of anybody who, interestingly enough, I think the Aztecs in Latin America have a story of some kind of exile, that they have some kind of journey to Tenochtitlan, to because they're Mexico, so there's a kind of epic of journeying with them, and then but what they do is they build this great city and they build an empire. There's no self-reflection out of that impoverishment. It's just a reversal, but with and a huge reversal. But with the biblical tradition, they do have a reversal. They come back, but they preserve the story and the stories that come out of that loss. So the loss itself becomes productive and fruitful, not simply for the sake of reversal, return, and rebuilding the city, but for the sake of transformation. How can we be in relationship in a different way from the experience that we've had? So I don't think the story doesn't exist. It's a unique story, and that's why it's the most popular book. It's a special story.
And Girard kind of makes a case that that's where we end up getting the novel, right? The modern novel.
Yes, yeah, really, yeah. All the
novelistic
really,
conversion, right?
You made about, yes. All the interesting novels are where the protagonists come up against that point. They fall into the pit of themselves, of their own failure, and then something else comes out of it. You see, that's what makes a novel really interesting, when we're led again and again to that point of loss and rebirth. In that sense, not simply that the thing is turned around, that the hero who lost everything becomes a hero again and destroys his enemies, but that the hero is now radically different, and to such an extent that the whole story has changed. The nature of humanity has changed. I think you're absolutely right. Girard says these novels, these great novels, Dostoevsky and Stendhal and Proust, they come out of that profound. The novelistic conversion comes out of that profound conversion. It's not a religious conversion. Well, it is. We can call it that. But most of all, it's an anthropological conversion. It's a conversion ultimately to the meaning of nonviolence, to the sense, to the intelligence of nonviolence, that there is a real intelligence in it, that I let go So, if the novelistic hero lets go of desire, he or she is really letting go of violence. I desire what the other has, and what the other has is incredibly meaningful to me because the other one wants it. Now, to let go of that is a start, and you're no longer hooked in. But what actually you've done, you've let go of the conflict with the other, and you've let go of violence as a way of being in the world. And to do that, there has to be another. So this is the point we get to. To let go of violence as a way of being in the world, there has to be another way of being in the world. You see, there has to be an alternative way of being in the world, which is just as and more real than the other. Because just as a moral revulsion against violence, it's not enough. Because we're talking anthropology here, we're talking about what it is to be human. And if there's not another way of being human, and if we can't learn it, then we're kind of stuck with this. We may as well go a whole hog with it, which is what some people think. May as well go the whole way with the.
When I mentioned imitating Jesus in politics, some Christians say no, we can't. We got to imitate Constantine, and I say,
yes, exactly right. You're right, David. That's the thing, that Jesus is impossible to imitate him in the political world, because Constantine more or less told us that, and everybody said, yeah, you're right, Constantine.
They say if it wasn't for Constantine, you wouldn't have your Christianity that you enjoy today. So that's why we have to go with that option to get, we can't do the full Jesus.
Okay, we had a detour for 1,500 years. That's right. But we presumably learned something over that this mechanism here has been to some degree changed. So we don't have to go off and slaughter the barbarians,
right.
Which is the way the Romans put it.
Is nonviolence tied fundamentally to overcoming the fear of death? Because if you think about mimesis, a lot of it is really death anxiety, right? That's driving that, because if you feeling like you have to grasp over scarce objects, whether it's prestige or social position or money or resources, often those things are because of this fundamental subconscious drive that we have scarcity of life and we need to suck the marrow to survive. It's kind of that survival instinct of, there's only so many years we have on this earth. And if we're afraid of that finality for whatever reason, it drives us to be envious and striving and, and aggressive in our desires.
Well, Ernest Becker, is often kind of twinned with Girard. There's a kind of parallel thinking there, but I think desire is more profound and more powerful than the fear of death. I wouldn't like to exclude that people do fear death.
Sure.
And will do what they can to avoid it, of course. But I also know people who face death willingly and almost joyfully, for the heroic option, I come from Irish parentage on my mother's side, and there's this, I think it's G.K. Chesterton said about the Irish, all their wars are merry and all their songs are sad. So there's a kind of lament for the hero, but then they go off to war. Apparently in Napoleon's time, when he had a regiment of Irish soldiers, when they saw them coming, they were, because they enjoyed war making, and people do enjoy, and there's a sense that it's only when, I think, possibly when death is stripped out of its heroic meaning, which is I think probably a Christian thing, or it's meaning as faith, that there's something that you hand yourself over to. Is when death is stripped out of all those meanings, then it does become really fearful. I think Christianity has made death fearful in its kind of like its negative impact. But I think that the way the ancients dealt with death was, in some ways, either heroic or the way animals deal with it. If you see an animal die, they decide, well, it's time to die. I don't particularly enjoy this, but I'm not scared out of my wits like a human being. So I think desire is ultimately the more powerful motivator than fear.
Huh. And ultimately in a Girardian sense, would be desire for the other's being, right?
Yes, exactly right. because we can think that we're going to get the others being through death. If I die heroically, then somehow or other I win. At least I'm going to. And the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy, is filled with those heroic deaths where the hero Boromir, for example, is so. He achieves this apotheosis in his death, and he's recognized as a great hero, and that's so he gets the others being, because everybody, that is the community, says yes, you are filled up with being, you're important. We do it kind of proleptically in anticipation, but it still satisfies the desire for the others being, and I think that's right. So traditional culture used that a lot, but I think something like the First World War, for example, really put a nail in that coffin. None of those deaths, the deaths in the trenches, were not heroic. They were awful, miserable, wretched deaths getting pounded by this artillery. And so that we've had a story which is little by little driven those desire motifs, and the heroic motifs out of our system. And so from a Girardian point of view, we're kind of left with the choice of violence or love. That's so I think this this leads us quite a way down the road, but I mean we're at a pretty critical point in time in our history where I think it's really hard to turn back the clock on a lot of these motifs, to try to go back to the way we were. It's hard being a human being today. We don't have the traditional recourses, but we do have love and forgiveness and compassion, and we're being invited into that. So I think it's also a great moment for humanity.
Yeah, it is. It's a escalation of both sides of our character, and of the goodness.
That's exactly right.
And it's
I think it's a very positive thing that we're in today. It doesn't, and I don't think like Christians basically understand that, or not many Christians understand it, that we're in a very positive moment. The churches are closing. There are no vocations in the Catholic setup. People are not coming to church like they used to do in the Protestant setup. Everybody, they're lamenting that. Well, yes, but something else is being born. It's what Paul talked about, the new anthropos, the new humanity that Christ brings.
Does that look like that? I mean, some people have said in order for humanity to get to where it needs to be in understanding nonviolence as the way of being, that it doesn't matter. They don't need to have the understanding of Jesus. They don't need to actually talk about Jesus or think about Jesus, the person. They just need to imitate that nonviolent aesthetic and ethic that you're describing. Would you say that is what's more important, so we could have functionally an atheistic society, but they're all imitating Jesus in their way? I don't think that works, though. You have to have the role model of Jesus.
No, you do have to have the role model.
Right.
And I think it works because people understand that people imitate Jesus without knowing they're doing it,
right?
Or without acknowledging it. You go into the stores and you have little statues of Elvis Presley and other pop heroes. And then you have Jesus. They're all like Jesus is the one against which, as John Lennon says, we're more famous than Christ. Right. That's the bar that's set.
Right.
You have to measure yourself. Yes, I think so. In terms of humanization, in terms of what it means to be human, Pele, the footballer, says that he says he's the most famous person in the world, second to Jesus. I mean, he says he's more famous than Coca-Cola or Elvis Presley. So he puts himself, but he would put himself second to Jesus. I mean, because Jesus absolutely is known. So this is crucified guy who's recognized as somehow or other an icon of humanity. So I'm not saying that's why I got cut off about what I was talking about when I got cut off. This is not a triumphalist statement. It's not to say, oh yes, Christianity wins, and our guy is better than your guy, it's better than Buddha or whatever. No, this is an essential pathway of human transformation, and the victory is a human victory. The victory to be more forgiving, compassionate, nonviolence is a human victory, and so when it says in the Gospels, the sign of the Son of Man will appear, and all the tribes, this is in Matthew's Gospel, all the tribes of the earth will lament. That's what it's about. It's about this meaning, this letting go of the old dysfunctional humanity, where everybody's against everybody else, and our triumph is to wipe out our enemies and to appear to conquer, to triumph over them. This is not a way of being. That sign is when that old semiotic register is transformed into something new, and we see what it means to be human, written large, somehow or other, and we're on the way to that. I do believe. I mean, we stumble on the way to it, but I think there are many indications that, for example, the Truth and Reconciliation organization in South Africa, when they went through the horrors of apartheid and decided not to victimize the perpetrators. They were perpetrators. They were guilty. They were completely guilty of having brutalized the 20 million Africans. But the process was not to make new victims, but just to bring the truth to the surface. I mean, things like that show that sign of the Son of Man is being recognized more and more. The Commission on Truth and Reconciliation, sorry.
When you look at the semiotics approach to the gospel, how do you look at something like when Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah? He indicates a big emphasis on that for understanding his work, right?
Who does?
Jesus, doesn't he mention the sign of Jonah?
Oh, Jesus! Oh, right, yeah. Sorry, David. Yes, you've read Virtually Christian, I think, because I put Jonah in there at the bottom, at the end there. Yes, I think that Jesus, and it seems a little noticed indicator to me, because in seminary you will study about Jesus as suffering servant, as Son of Man, as Messiah, Christ, all these traditional titles. But, the sign of Jonah is just not treated. I mean, I never saw it there. I never heard of the sign of Jonah being, but it seems to be incredibly informative semiotically, because Jonah is such a loser, basically. He's such a kind of anti-prophet. He doesn't do what he's supposed to do, and he's miserable all the time. I mean, he does get a big break where he's rescued from the sea by the big fish, and he makes this great prayer. But he has this beautiful prayer, but then he forgets it all, or seems to forget it all. So when Jesus says, "What is this? No sign will be given to you but the sign of Jonah," the tradition interprets that as the resurrection, and of course that is part of it. But the whole story of Jonah, which is really only 4 chapters, and it's very short, is a semiotic masterpiece. It demonstrates the process of victimization, but at a meta level, because the sailors don't want to do it. Jonah wants it because of his miserable mindset. He's a kind of passive violence on his part, and then God restores him from it, because God is the God of redemption, release, and that then applies to the Ninevites, who let go of their violence. I mean, that's what the king says to them, all of you let go of the violence that you have in your hand. And Nineveh was the zenith of oppressive military empire. Probably not at the time that Jonah was written, but looking back, the Assyrians were the great enemy, the great Satan. And so you have this turning around. It's just a pure work of fiction. That's what's so marvelous about it. And then Jesus invokes it. He doesn't say you'll have the sign of Elijah or the sign of Isaiah. He says you'll have the sign of this bit of fiction, this bit of semiosis, Jonah, and that's what I'm doing. So pay attention. That's what I'm turning this thing around.
And would the Romans and the Gentile world be the Ninevites in this context? Yeah,
totally. They were the Ninevites. They were the baddest of the bad guys. I mean, they had perfected the art of warfare. No one could stand against them. Their legions were the supreme tool, military tool at the time, equivalent to nuclear submarines or attack jets. I mean, to come up against the legion was to lose. And they controlled the whole world.
Did Jesus have a plan to do his death in such a way with the Roman Empire that he suspected it might infect the Roman Empire after his death?
Well, David, I don't know. I think in life, I mean, you're asking me a question that, and I kind of said some of those things to James Allison, what we've been talking about. And James, at that time anyway, James Allison was not at all in favor of trying to investigate the subjectivity of Jesus, what he was actually thinking. Jesus did what he had to do, and that he did it. But I think you do have to see the subjectivity of Jesus, especially he doesn't retaliate, and that he is also a man of his culture. And so he does embrace things like Jonah and the kingdom of God and the book of Daniel, all that kind of stuff. But what he actually anticipated happening as a result of this action of his, that's kind of like a bridge too far. And he does say nobody knows, not even the Son of Man knows. Only the Father knows how this is all going to play out. And I think that in human life, God protect us from having to do this, but there's always a kind of gamble, that to make this really work, you have to gamble everything you have. You have to throw it all. There can't be anything held back. And I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a great example of that. He had decided to be part of the plot to kill Hitler, and that from a instrumental political point of view, it was the obvious thing to do. But the plot failed, and apparently Bonhoeffer still had the chance to escape when he was in the prison in Berlin. But he decides to stay, knowing that he's going to be executed. So it becomes a pure value in itself. His death, he decides his death in the midst of this system becomes value in itself. Now all he's ever seen is the triumph of the Nazis and the horror that the Nazis have brought. So he feels that he has to pitch his death, I think, because he could have escaped. So there's something in him that says, I have to make this death a countersign to what my death, a countersign to what has just happened in these past 5-6 years. And he doesn't know whether that's going to succeed. He just does not know that. How can you know that? I mean, there's just mayhem everywhere, and the Russians at the gates, and the Russians have their own system, which they're going to impose. So he has no way of knowing that. And so as Christians, we always, I think, following Jesus, I think there's a certain point. And so his cry on the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me, is kind of reflective of that. I know they say he's quoting the whole of the Psalm, which has faith and restoration as his final vision. But nevertheless, there's this sense of abandonment, and Jesus enters into that space. And Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher, the American philosopher, is very much into that, into the fact that Jesus kind of entered into that space, which is for him, then that returns as full circle to the whole thing of metaphysics. He says that deconstructs metaphysics, that Jesus evacuates God from the universe by
the death of the big other, right? Yeah,
that's right. Exactly right. That's exactly right. And there's something necessary about that. Like we all have that powerful other on our side, and there has that. So Jesus. So in answer to your question, in this way, is that I don't think Jesus knew definitively. I mean, it's an act of faith. It's an act of faith, and it still is. It still is an act of faith that the death of. So when Zizek takes that as something to run with, it's important that the big other does have to die, and then the semiosis, which is where he doesn't use that language, but he says the action of the praxis of love takes over, and he sees that as coming from the death of Christ, and I think that's very important.
In your book, you talk about John Deely, the philosopher, the late philosopher who was very powerful in explaining semiotics and its history. For fans of Girard who are not familiar with John Deely, what should they want to learn from John? What can they learn from John Deely?
Well, John Deely is a bit of a polymath, and I only kind of discovered him later on. And he's written a lot, and he has this kind of encyclopedic knowledge of, especially the scholastic tradition. I mean, he knows a lot about the Greek tradition and the modern tradition, but I mean, there were some little things you could probably query him on, but especially scholastic, he's unrivaled. And he wrote this kind of magisterial tome called The Four Ages of Understanding, which basically maps out what I was saying, or what I would be arguing, from the Girardian postmodern perspective, that the world has changed, metaphysics has collapsed, that the sign of a relationship of love is what gives meaning today. He kind of maps that process out without saying that's where he's going to end up. He basically says there's this movement from the Greek age through the Latin age, through the modern age, to the postmodern age, and it tends away from metaphysics towards semiotics. Now, he has a very realist concept of semiotics, so that needs to be thrown in there. He's very much a scholastic in that sense. The world is real. What a sign reveals about the world is true. He doesn't like postmodernism in the sense of the way it dissolves the world purely into signifiers and perspectives, various perspectives. He doesn't like that at all. So Charles Sanders Peirce is his hero of the postmodern.
Girard would kind of agree with him on that point, right?
He would. Yeah. Girard would agree with him on that point. Girard was a realist, and he probably, if he'd ever dealt with Peirce, he would have embraced Peirce. So in some sense, Girard was more a scholastic semiotician than he was a postmodern semiotician. That he was seen the value of this, because something we haven't talked about is Girard shows the origins of science, the original sign being the victim. He says this explicitly, and he lays it out, he explains it. So Girard is an evolutionary semiotician. He shows how signs emerge at the beginning of hominization. So he's a very important semiotic thinker in that sense. But in terms of the kind of Western history of semiotics, he would probably side with Peirce in that sense. In a real
Deely or Peirce? Are you talking about Deely or Peirce?
Well, Deely as well.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So he certainly would side with Deely. But what Deely does is
he kind of revives Peirce, right? He does
revive Peirce, and he shows that postmodernism. He deals in some way with I mean, he sees that modernism and postmodernism in terms of philosophy are dead ends. Now that's where I would depart from him. I would not agree with Dealey. So Dealey, if for the sake of explaining him to the listeners, Dealey shows that semiotics has always been emerging in the Western tradition. In the Latin tradition, especially from Augustine onwards, but then through Aquinas and other thinkers, he shows it become, and then so Peirce is Dealey's big hero in terms of semiotics. And so he then wants to dismiss the modern, i.e. Descartes and Locke style of philosophy, and then the postmodernists, especially Derrida, as a kind of dead end. But I differ from that to some degree. It would be my difference from Girard, as if Girard ever was to describe himself as a semiotician, that the modern and the postmodern detour are really necessary in order for the sake of the turn to the subject. You need to look at the eye that is looking, which is something you get from Vico and Descartes and Kant. You need to examine the eye that is looking. So it's not simply what's out there, it's how you look at it, how you see it. And Girard is very much about the eye that is looking. You know, the anthropological construct of original violence is very much a constructed optic. And it's the way in which we've seen and managed the world. So he doesn't go down that road, but I argue in Theology Beyond Metaphysics that he belongs on that road. So that's where I would make it a story of Girard that wouldn't be entirely Girard's own, you know.
So you would say, are you a realist as well with like Dealey, but you just feel like the postmodern and modern detours are not dead ends, but rather were necessary stops along the way that we can go back to realism with?
Well, I would say realism is always in the process of being revised. So if you talk about a quantum mechanics or that level small particle, what is reality there? We have some vague kind of images of it in terms of electrons have spin, so we see these little things spinning around, and then you reverse the spin. So we have some sense of what we could look at and see out there, but really it's only penetrated by mathematics. It's only those who follow the math through, who know the math properly, who can properly understand this. So a visual image of quantum mechanics is basically beyond us. And so that is always being revised. It's not that to say that an electron has spin is false. It's not false. It's real. But it's one way of describing it. So there's going to be other ways of describing it at other levels. So it's not like realism. So I'm looking out my window now and I see a road and a house. Is that really a road and a house? Or is it a name that we attach to a material process that is important for us in our world? And when we attach the name to it, there are all sorts of associations that flood in with that name. And so it is rich and dense with meaning, but is that really a road? Is that really a house? No, it's something that we see, and we see with a very powerful structure of seeing that has come to us, Girard says, through original violence. So the ultimate realism, I would say, is love, and that's somewhere we're not at. I'm not at. We're still working our way toward that. And what does it mean to be in love with someone and to love someone, especially your enemy? What is that? What is the realism of that? I mean, those are powerful questions. So I think, as Peirce would explain, and Dealey upholds, that ultimate realism is itself a process. It's not a one-to-one correspondence, which is kind of like a childish way of looking at what we see.
Yeah, I think that's something that I've been interested in trying to figure out, and I see some evidence there with a physicist friend of mine who comes on my radio show, where we're looking to see the physics of mimetic desire. And I think semiotics provides some help for this, to see if there's a way to bridge the gap between the hard sciences and the social sciences, not to make everything mechanistic, but rather to kind of explain what's going on, because it does seem to there seems to be a kind of pattern in nature. When I walk on by the lake and I see the patterns of ducks where they're circling each other like little magnets, and it looks so and it looks like mimesis on a more basic level.
Yeah.
And they're doing the little patterns and stuff. And you look at that and you're like, this sounds like a lunchroom drama with two guys or people fighting over a girlfriend or something. It just seems very, you see it everywhere in nature and stuff.
Absolutely. Nature is mimetic. One thing imitates another in order to survive and in order to gain an advantage on each other. It's what is that? There's that butterfly or moth that mimics the face of an owl. So a bird trying to eat that moth suddenly comes up close and veers away because suddenly seen an owl. Nature is highly mimetic. So yes, there is. And what is it that what is the actual neural and electronic process that makes me look at your face, for example, David, and pick up their meaning of what you're thinking, how you're feeling, what your intentions are, all that communication that's going on all the time is a highly the last cover conference was on robotics, and robots are nowhere near doing that empathic possibility. So yes, I think there's huge.
That's why we have to be careful with putting masks on 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds for years, because you can't children can't develop properly mimetic cues. Yeah,
it's a what is a hierarchy of values, and what's the most important thing,
right?
Preserving the child from being infected or infecting others, or its development. There is a balance. There's it's the human guessing game. There's a kind of balance in everything.
Do you see that semiotics provides like almost apologetic evidence for the Trinity because of the triadic nature of, the Holy Spirit is both person and relationship, and that's kind of
really
what I.
Really.
Do you see something there?
I do, David. I do. I mean, I try not to be, because all this, you create a systemic way of thinking, and it's persuasive, it's comprehensive, and it's transformative. As I say, and so I try not to be triumphalistic about it, because Jesus died on, like we were describing there, saying, my God, where are you? But yes, and I think Peirce very much sees he has a huge number of triads, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 different triads he sees. And triadic thinking is really important, that the first and the second, in whatever triad you're talking about, doesn't have meaning until you get to the third. The relationship of the first and second depends on the progress to the third. And on and on indefinitely, so that then the second and third will depend on another fourth, which will be the third for them. That the triadic thinking is progressive thinking and process thinking, and so to be in relationship, which is what this is all about. That the universe is fundamentally in relationship with itself, which I think is like kind of evolutionary. Atheists don't admit, that in order for evolution to work, there still has to be a universe that's fundamentally in relationship with itself. Natural selection does take place for sure, and it makes a lot of sense. But for that to work, there has to be a connective relationship that underpins it. So this relationship, and then the relationship that you get in the Gospels between this figure Jesus, who is an historical figure. See, this is where the Trinity comes from. It is an intensely semiotic doctrine. It doesn't come from abstract first principle thinking, like Aristotelian or Platonic thinking. It comes from an historical figure who, because of what he did and how he spoke, he configures this reality we call God in relationship to himself. And so he already invokes a relationship. And then, because that relationship becomes proactive and exponential after his death, it prompts a third. It becomes a third because it begins to exist elsewhere, exist in us. So like Jesus is following through the Joseph story or the Job story, whatever, the suffering servant, transforms the notion of God. And as we were saying before, okay, there are triads in other worlds. There are Hindu triads of Hindu gods who are important. So triads are not just solely by any means Christian, but they are a way of thinking, and they're a very productive way of thinking. You possibly could go along that line in terms of some kind of natural theology, that triadic thinking is natural theology, but I don't want to go there because it's too complicated. But essentially, that Jesus introduces that kind of formula for who God is into human discourse. And then we begin to see that relationships all work in that way. So I think that Peirce's triads, especially the triad that I use a lot, which is the object, the sign, and the interpretant, that you can't have a sign of an object without a further sign, which is the interpretant. So really you have object and two signs. One is the sign and then the interpreter of the sign. So it's always a kind of fugue of thinking that allows you to communicate. And by the way, this is all going on in our heads, even as we talk. All this process is going on in our heads seamlessly without us reflecting on it at all. But there has to be something like that happening. So that's a marvel to behold in itself. But anyhow, Peirce's and before him, this guy called Poinsot, and before him, according to Dealey, Aquinas, based their kind of like primitive understanding of semiotics in the Trinity. So the Trinitarian thinking prompts semiotic thinking, I think. And that's probably one reason why Dealey does not like Derrida, because that's kind of more dualistic in terms of Saussure's semiotics, which are basically the signifier and the signified, whereas Dealey and Peirce are more triadic. But still, as I say, because of that concentration on the human thinker, of the process of thinking, and the human eye, that kind of semiotics is also important. But yes, I mean, I think the Trinity is an intervention in human space prompted by Jesus. It transforms all our relations. It brings us into a relational reality. I mean, the first mover, or the highest form, the sun, the light in Plato, is a distant monolith. It's something that is encased in itself. It's like the monolith in 2001. But what we get in the Christian proclamation is always relation. It's always relationship into which you are invited. So a thinking that is founded in relation and expresses relation is much more appropriate for the Christian tradition than that kind of monolithic, I would say, Greek thought.
That's very interesting, and I think this is a great introduction to what you're doing in your new book, Theology Beyond Metaphysics. And I really appreciate you spending this time unpacking these ideas and getting them introduced to our audience.
Well, David, I thank you for this opportunity. I mean, you're a great communicator, and to have someone, invite me to do this, of course, I like to talk about this stuff. No doubt about it, it's what I do. You give me the opportunity to do it, but it has a point and purpose. I think it's not just egotistic. It's for the sake of what we've talked about. So great thanks to you. Thank you.
And I want people to check out your website too, to learn more about what you're doing. BethanyCenter.community is your website, BethanyCenter.community. Thanks again.
Thank you, David. Are we signing off now?
Yeah.
All right then.
Thank you.
All the best.